In 1940, Florida was the least populated state in the entire South. Fewer people than Mississippi, fewer than Arkansas, a swampy frontier most Americans avoided entirely. Today it is the third most populous state in America, home to over 22 million residents. But that transformation was not driven by industry or agriculture or some gold rush. It was driven by a single invention, one machine that turned an uninhabitable swamp into one of the fastest growing places on Earth. And understanding that machine explains why Florida behaves like the opposite of every other state in the country. To understand why Florida behaves unlike any other state, you have to start underneath it. The entire Florida peninsula is a limestone platform, porous like a sponge, sitting barely above sea level. No point in the state is more than about 60 miles from the ocean. Florida has roughly 8,400 miles of shoreline, the longest of any state in the contiguous United States. Yet much of that coast sits on rock that seawalls cannot protect. Water does not just crash against the shore here, it seeps up through the ground itself. The Floridan Aquifer, a vast groundwater system running through that same Swiss cheese limestone, supplies drinking water to over 90% of Floridians. It is one of the most productive aquifer systems in the world, and it sits inside stone that is slowly dissolving. Sinkholes open without warning, swallowing cars, bedrooms, entire sections of highway, because the rock beneath is riddled with cavities carved by acidic rainwater over millions of years. In 2013, a sinkhole opened beneath a house in Seffner and swallowed a man while he slept. His body was never recovered. The ground simply took him. Other states were built on bedrock, granite, sandstone, formations that hold firm for centuries. Florida was built on a reef, a platform of ancient coral and compressed shells that water passes through the way it passes through a kitchen sponge. This geological fragility is the engine behind everything that follows: the flooding, the insurance crises, the persistent sense that the whole project is temporary. Most states fight geography to grow. Florida ignored it entirely. But here is what most people do not realize. For most of American history, almost nobody wanted to live on this ground. Flip the assumption that Florida has always been a major state. In 1950, Florida had fewer people than Iowa, fewer than Minnesota. Before air conditioning, summer life was brutal, a kind of endurance test that most Americans chose to fail by simply staying away. Pre-AC accounts describe Floridians sleeping on porches because the inside of their homes was unbearable, shuttering businesses during midday heat, and enduring swarms of mosquitoes so thick they darkened the air at dusk. This was not the tropics of vacation brochures. It was closer to subtropical jungle than modern suburb. The Seminole Wars dragged on for decades, making the interior dangerous and expensive to settle. Army expeditions waded through chest-deep swamp water for days, chasing an enemy that knew the land better than any map could show. The plantation economy that defined Georgia and the Carolinas never took deep root here. The soil was too sandy, the terrain too wet, the growing conditions too unpredictable for the kind of large-scale cotton agriculture that built fortunes further north. Florida's first state flag reportedly carried the motto, "Let us alone," not a call to arms, but a shrug. A posture of isolation, not ambition. While other southern states built deep-rooted cultures over generations, families tied to land, towns tied to churches, economies tied to cotton, Florida sat empty. A humid peninsula dangling off the edge of the continent, waiting for something that had not been invented yet. So when Florida's first real growth finally came, it was not the slow, organic kind that built other American states. It was speculative mania, and it was a disaster. Promoters like Henry Flagler and Carl Fisher carved planned cities out of drained Everglades, Coral Gables, Miami Beach, Hollywood, lining new boulevards with imported palm trees, ornamental canals, and Mediterranean-style facades designed to sell a fantasy of tropical Europe to northern buyers who had never set foot in the state. The 1920s land boom turned swampland into gold seemingly overnight. Speculators flipped lots they had never seen. Towns were platted on land that was still underwater. Advertisements promised paradise, and for a brief, dizzying moment, the money seemed to prove them right. Prices doubled, tripled, and then doubled again. A waterfront lot in Miami Beach that sold for a few $100s might change hands 3 times in a week, each time at a higher price. The mania was so intense that the Florida East Coast Railway imposed an embargo on non-essential freight. The rail lines were clogged with building materials headed south, and there was literally no room for food or fuel. Then the bubble burst. A catastrophic hurricane in 1926 ripped through Miami, killing hundreds and exposing the lie that you could build paradise on quicksand. Another storm in 1928 overwhelmed the dike around Lake Okeechobee, flooding surrounding towns and killing an estimated 2,500 people, most of them black migrant workers whose bodies were buried in mass graves. Scandal followed. Investors fled. The boom collapsed years before the Great Depression even started. Florida became the first American warning signal for what speculative mania could do to an entire region. Most states built economies on industry or agriculture, slow, rooted, durable. Florida tried to build one on imagination, and it failed. The first time. But then, in the span of a single decade, 3 technologies arrived at the same moment, and they did not just revive Florida. They created an entirely new state. Air conditioning, interstate highways, and commercial jet travel converged on Florida in the post-war years, and the effect was like detonating a population bomb. Florida went from under 3 million residents in 1950 to roughly 16 million by 2000, a 6-fold increase in 50 years. That is not growth. That is colonization. Air conditioning was the catalyst that unlocked everything else. Before window units became affordable in the 1950s, Florida's climate was a barrier, the reason people visited in winter and left by April. Suddenly the heat was manageable. The mosquitoes could be kept outside. A house in Tampa or Fort Lauderdale was no longer an endurance test. It was just a house. One post-war chronicler put it plainly, today's Florida is possible only because of air conditioning. The interstates arrived next. I-75 and I-95 became migration corridors, funneling Midwesterners and Northeasterners straight into the peninsula like rivers of asphalt pouring people south. Retirees from Ohio and Michigan loaded station wagons and drove into master-planned communities that had not existed a decade earlier. Developments with names like Sun City Center and Century Village, where every house looked the same and every lawn was trimmed on the same schedule. Cuban exiles fleeing the revolution rebuilt entire neighborhoods in Miami, transforming the city into a bilingual capital with economic ties stretching across the hemisphere. Haitian, Colombian, and Nicaraguan communities followed, each one adding another layer to a city that was reinventing itself faster than any planner could track. Walt Disney bought a county's worth of swampland near Orlando and turned it into the most visited destination on Earth. Pro-growth politicians locked in a model: no state income tax, minimal regulation, a constitutional structure designed to attract newcomers rather than nurture existing communities. The message was simple: come here, spend money, build something. Nobody asked what would hold it all together. Other states evolved over centuries from local populations. They grew the way oak trees grow, slowly from deep roots. Florida was assembled from spare parts, imported people, imported cultures, imported politics, all arriving at once on a peninsula that had no existing identity strong enough to absorb them. A 1948 writer called Florida a study in abnormal psychology, useful in signaling the hidden derangements of the national mood. That was not an insult, it was a diagnosis. And because all those people arrived from such radically different places, what emerged was not one state, it was something no other state in America has ever been. The Panhandle operates culturally like Alabama. Church steeples, military bases, and Friday night football under humid skies. Central Florida around Orlando feels like the Midwest transplanted into palm trees, chain restaurants, subdivisions, families who moved from Indiana or Wisconsin and brought their habits with them. Miami functions like a Latin American capital, more Havana or Bogota than Atlanta or Charlotte. The Space Coast is its own techno-industrial world. The retirement communities of the Gulf Coast are frozen slices of 1970s Ohio and Michigan, gated and self-contained. and the Keys operate under rules that do not seem to apply anywhere else on the mainland. No other state contains this range of competing identities with so little connective tissue between them. Drive 4 hours in most states and the accent changes slightly, the barbecue style shifts, but you are recognizably in the same place. Drive 4 hours in Florida and you cross between civilizations. This is the direct result of the Big Bang migration, millions of people arriving from radically different origins, settling in different geographic zones, and never blending into a single coherent culture. Other states have regional differences. Florida has regional countries. This fragmentation is why Florida became the ultimate political swing state for decades. Its elections were not simply left versus right. They were several different Americas voting under one roof. A retired auto worker from Michigan, a Cuban exile from Havana, a Southern Baptist from the Panhandle, and a tech worker from California, all casting ballots in the same state with almost nothing in common except a zip code. The 2000 presidential recount was not a fluke. It was the mathematical expression of a state that cannot agree on what it is. But the thing that really makes Florida seem unlike every other state, the thing the whole world jokes about, is not what people think it is. Most people assume Florida has uniquely unhinged residents. The Florida Man headlines, the alligator in the drive-thru, the naked man on the highway, the crimes so bizarre they read like fiction, suggest something is deeply, specifically wrong with this place. But the real answer is structural, not cultural. Florida has some of the strongest open records and public access laws in the country, the Sunshine Laws. Any arrest report, any police record, any government document is available to journalists and the public almost immediately. A reporter in Florida can pull a police booking file the same day it is filed. In most other states, that process takes weeks or requires a formal request, or simply never happens because the records are sealed. Every state has bizarre crimes and absurd human behavior. Florida is just the one that lets you read about them the next morning. Layer onto that the sheer density of the situation. Roughly 22 million permanent residents and approximately 100 million annual tourists are funneled into a narrow coastal and I-4 corridor strip. When you pack that many people into that little space, strangers from dozens of different cultures, crammed into the same gas stations, highways, and emergency rooms, collisions are inevitable. The state also ranks around 49th in the nation for mental health spending per capita. That means fewer treatment beds, fewer crisis intervention programs, and more situations that end with a police report instead of a hospital intake form. Florida Man is not a character flaw. It is a transparency feature running on top of a population density problem, both consequences of the same forces that built the state. And now, the geology that everyone ignored when they built all of this, the limestone sponge from the very beginning of this story, is starting to catch up. Sea levels are rising, and Florida's porous bedrock means seawalls are nearly useless. This is the part most people outside Florida do not understand. In a state built on granite or clay, you can build a wall and keep water out. In Florida, the water does not crash over the barrier. It comes up through the ground itself, bubbling through storm drains, flooding streets from below, seeping into basements that were dry for decades. Miami-Dade County now experiences regular tidal flooding on sunny days, not during storms, but on ordinary afternoons when the tide is high and the moon is full. The Floridan aquifer, the same system that supplies drinking water to over 90% of residents, is increasingly vulnerable to saltwater intrusion. As ocean levels creep higher, saltwater pushes inland through the porous limestone, contaminating freshwater wells one by one. Insurance companies are pulling out of the state. Premiums have doubled or tripled in some coastal counties, and major national carriers have simply stopped writing new policies altogether. Homeowners who could afford a mortgage 10 years ago now cannot afford the insurance required to hold one. Billions of dollars of real estate sit on land that may be uninsurable within a generation. Condos, resorts, and retirement communities that were sold as permanent investments on a peninsula where permanence was never guaranteed. And unlike other low-lying states, there is no high ground to retreat to. The giant reservoirs and river systems that places like Louisiana or the Carolinas rely on for managed withdrawal do not exist here. The highest natural point in Florida is Britton Hill, barely 345 feet above sea level, tucked in the far northwest corner of the Panhandle. The rest of the peninsula is so flat and so low that a few feet of sea level rise redraws the coastline for miles. Scientists are still mapping the full extent of the sinkhole-prone karst systems under the peninsula, modeling how they will respond to the combined stresses of drought, groundwater pumping, and rising seas. Florida built itself into the opposite of every other state: fast, rootless, spectacle-driven, and now faces an opposite kind of reckoning. Most states worry about economic decline or cultural change. Florida has to worry about whether the ground itself will continue to cooperate. So why is Florida the opposite of every other US state? Because every force that shaped it ran in reverse. Outsiders who arrived with no shared outsiders, who arrived with no shared history. Most states sit on solid ground. Florida sits on dissolving limestone. Most states developed a single cultural identity over time. Florida contains several competing ones that never merged. Most states hide their dysfunction behind closed records. Florida's transparency laws broadcast it to the world. Even the growth model is inverted. No state income tax, minimal regulation, a constitutional structure designed to attract people rather than serve them long term. Florida is not broken, it is functioning exactly as it was designed to, as a machine for growth, spectacle, and reinvention, sitting on a peninsula that was never meant to hold this many people. Every other state was shaped by its geography over centuries of slow adaptation. Florida is the one that tried to override it, all at once, in a single generation, with air conditioning and ambition. And whether that experiment can continue depends on forces far older and far more powerful than anything humans built here. The limestone does not care about property values. The ocean does not read zoning laws, and the ground beneath Florida is still making decisions, just as it always has. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, check out one of the videos on screen right now. Like the video if you learned something new, and subscribe if you want more stories like this one.